Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today we're going to talk about how to read ballot measures. With election season in full swing, many states and local areas will have ballot measures for you to vote on, which means that there are some policies that you, the voters, get to decide whether they become law. And they'll cover a wide range of policy areas, including redistricting, citizenship requirements for voting, ranked choice voting, campaign contribution limits, government official salaries, transgender policies, taxes, and age limits for officials, just to name a few. And some have even been voted on already, including a couple of high profile ones you've probably already heard about. And as such, you should really know what these ballot measures say. But of course, that is easier said than done. They can be difficult to research, and when you do find them, they can still be difficult to read. Fortunately, I'm here to help you today. Today, I have plenty of tips that you can use to help make yourself the most informed you can be when you go to the ballot box. And I'll be covering where you can find these measures, why it can be difficult to read them, tips for making them easier to read, the different parts of a ballot measure, the tug and pull between a measure summary and its full text, and what to watch out for when it comes to the political games that are played with these ballot measures. And some of these principles I've adapted from a webinar I do where I teach companies and organizations how to read and interpret bills and legislation being written and debated by state and federal governments. And if you want to learn more about that and have the webinar presented to your own organization, message me about it on LinkedIn or email me at paulritterwrites@gmail.com. But for now, let's talk about ballot measures. So, where do you find ballot measures? Two basic ways to really find out what ballot measures you can vote on and what they say. You can either go to Ballotpedia's ballot measures content, or you can go to your chief elections official website. And so the basic process of how to find these ballot measures, if you're going to go the Ballotpedia route, you go to ballotpedia.org. You can either search for ballot measures in the search bar up at the top, or you can scroll down the page, the front page, to the link for ballot measures. There will be a specific link for that somewhere sort of in the middle of the page, or you can go all the way down to the bottom and you'll see amongst the plethora of links there, links to both the state and local ballot measures content on the website. And when you're in that portal for ballot measures, there's a drop-down option near the top of the page that will include a link directly to the current elections measures. And there are also options you can use to search ballot measures by subject matter or their topic. There are states, campaign finance reports, polling, signature drives, history, and so on. If you go the chief elections official's website, it's hard to really give you a specific, this is how you do it, because all of these websites are so different and how they are navigated and so on. And in a large majority of cases, the chief elections official is going to be the state's secretary of state. Just like there's a secretary of state for the federal government, there is a secretary of state for the vast majority of states. I believe it's 47 out of 50 that have one. But in certain cases, there will be a specific elections administrator that will be in this role. There might be an elections commission. And in a couple of cases in Utah and Alaska, there will be the lieutenant governor who is the chief elections official. And so you could search for that official's respective website and navigate to their ballot measures section that way. Sometimes there'll be a search bar you can use, or they'll have a specific section of, what's on your ballot, and you can go click on that, or they might even say ballot measures. Again, because there's so many of these different states and they all vary in how difficult it can be to navigate these websites, it's really hard to give you a concrete, this is the process you use. So you'll probably have to be using the search bar several times, but you'll want to look for that chief elections official in that state for their website. And to find that, if you want to look up who the state or the chief election official in your state is, you can go to the National Conference of State Legislatures. They have that information on hand. They have a nice handy list telling you who that is. But chances are it's going to be your state's Secretary of State. Now, Let's say you've found these ballot measures that you're trying to look for. You also get the sample ballot sent to you. That's going to be sent to you sometime before your actual election that you vote in, and you'll be able to get that there. But now, let's say that you've come up to your ballot measures and you have them on hand. How difficult is it to read ballot measures? Ballot measures are potentially going to be put into law, obviously. That's why they're being voted on. So they have to look like something you'd see in laws in some fashion. And reading policies and laws and such can be intimidating for many people. That's part of the reason why I have a webinar about how to read legislation that governments and legislatures are debating. Besides having to take the time to figure out where to find these measures, you have to actually be able to parse the words. And sometimes these words can be very dense. And they're often written in what is called legalese, which is an actual word. It's not just a funny remark that people make to try to poke fun at how laws are written. It's actually called legalese. And so that can look very dense and highfalutin. And to be honest, a lot of times it is. And that density often contributes to a plethora of court cases about the meaning of these legal texts, and it's notoriously difficult for the public to understand. Even if you can actually understand what the words mean, just the way they're constructed and the way that they're packed together and just how much text you have to read, it can be very exhausting, intimidating, or just like, you know what, I'm going to spend my time doing something else. And to some extent, the powers that be kind of hope you do that. More on that in a second. But how do we calculate the difficulty of reading ballot measures? Because the average level of readability of ballot measures is typically quite higher than the literacy level of the average voter. Sometimes you can require bachelor's, master's, PhD to really be able to fully comprehend, or at least to be able to comprehend easily without having to spend time reading that ballot measure. And so there are some formulas that can be used to sort of quantify that level of readability. And two examples that are highlighted by Ballotpedia in that regard are the Flesch Reading Ease, FRE, and the Flesch-Kincaid grade level formula. And Flesch-Kincaid is really a revision of the FRE because it's that, I forget his first name, but the Mr. or Dr. Flesch has a heavy hand in both of those. But both are formulas that involve a count of the total words and total sentences in these measures. And not just necessarily for ballot measures, just for things in general. It's a mathematical calculation based on total words and total sentences. But there isn't really a formula that exists that can account for the difficulty or complexity of the ideas and ballot measures themselves. Sure, somebody could maybe read what the actual words are, maybe even know what the words are saying, but trying to put the idea together of, okay, what is this exactly trying to do is not always straightforward. And sometimes you need to spend time to think about that, especially if it's a really long ballot measure, because some ballot measures are longer than others, which we'll talk about in a little bit too. But some subject matter is going to be more comprehensible for one group of people, but not others. And then that other group of people might find another topic to be more comprehensible than that first group would. So there's no real one-size-fits-all policy when it comes to figuring out, oh, okay, this is how difficult this content is to read. It's one thing to know what the words are and what they're actually saying, how to pronounce them, but it's another to really understand what the law is trying to get at. Again, it goes back to that whole legalese concept. So why not just make legal writing easier, make these ballot measures easier to read, making these laws that are already on the books easier to read? Why not? Why write it in legalese? Why not just write it in plain English? Because the benefits are, well, the intention of the laws would become more concrete and understandable because anybody can read them, or at least most people can read them. It would help improve civic knowledge because it's a lot easier for people to know what laws are on the books. The public would be better educated on what the laws are. Problem is, legalese also allows for greater precision in making laws. It's a lot more applicable to court cases than it is just to write it in plain English. It's kind of hard to get at. But it would also be very costly and time consuming to rewrite all the laws that we do have to be more modern. And to be honest, a lot of poor old lawyers would be out of a job because their services in reading and arguing law would be much less required. And now it's easy for me to make fun of lawyers for that, but also modernizing legalese would also admittedly hinder me because then my webinar on how to read and interpret legislation would be a lot less valuable because a lot more people can do it. So I guess I shouldn't throw too many stones in my glass house, so to speak. But some of it is just because lawyers want to keep their jobs and get paid and make you have to go to them. So it behooves them to defend legalese. But in fairness, it is also difficult to just have everything just rewritten in plain English. And also, how do you codify it so you say, oh yeah, this is just plainly written? It's one of those things that sounds easier to do than it actually is. And you unfortunately find that to be the case a lot of times when it comes to making things laws. But that said, there are some measures in place that do make ballot measures easier to read. As of 2025, 21 states have laws on the books that govern ballot measure readability, according to Ballotpedia. And sometimes these laws are a simple, vague, ballot measures need to be in simple language. They need to be written in plain English. And then sometimes explicit criteria is required, like a number of words for the summary, or even references to those reading formulas. Like, I think it's Arkansas that specifically references the Flesch-Kincaid grade level formula. Or it could be some other sort of stipulation. So sometimes it's a vague requirement to be readable. Other times they have more stipulations for it to be readable. And then indirectly related to that readability requirement, but still has some level of relevance, you have a single subject rule and you have separate vote requirements. So a single subject rule means that each ballot measure can only address one topic or issue. And of the 26 states that allow for citizen-initiated measures, because that's what the single subject rule is applied to, 16 of them require each ballot measure to only focus on a single subject. So 10 states do not require you to have a single subject for your ballot measure, so they can cover a whole bunch of different things. So you want to have a ballot measure that talks about marijuana, recreational marijuana, but then you want to also talk about bump stocks on guns. Well, you can do that in several of those states. States that require a single subject rule, not going to be able to do them. But there can also be some instances where the single subject rule is not necessarily clear cut. Healthcare, for example, is one big topic. But could you try to argue that certain aspects in healthcare are not related to each other and therefore it's not single subject? Like if you talk about how to help mothers in childbirth versus transgender transitioning healthcare policies, are those two different subjects? Some people might say, well, that's under the umbrella of healthcare. So yes, it is one subject. Some people will say those are two very disparate subjects within the sphere of healthcare. So really, they're actually two different subjects. It can be sometimes not a clear-cut answer, and different interests will argue one way or another. And then the separate vote requirement means that a proposed constitutional amendments must be made into separate ballot questions. You can't just all cobble them all together. And 32 states have that requirement. So not necessarily explicitly about readability of legislation, but when you do have single subject rules and you do have separate vote requirements, it does inherently make these ballot measures easier to read because there's a lot less content that is compiled within each of these ballot measures. But regardless of any of that, what are the parts of a ballot measure? Because it's not just simply, oh, hey, here's a ballot measure, yes or no. No, there are specific pieces that you need to know before you actually decide whether to vote yes or no. So there are 4 main pieces that you need to know. There's the title of the ballot measure, there's the summary, there's the full text, and when available, a fiscal impact statement. Each state has different requirements as to what their fiscal impact statements need, who makes those fiscal impact statements, how in depth they need to be, whether they actually appear on the ballot, all sorts of different things. But in a lot of cases, you will see a fiscal impact statement where it says, if this ballot measure passes, here's the impact on government revenues and taxes and all that jazz. Here's what's going to happen. And of course, their projections, you can't necessarily say for sure this is what's going to happen, but they have to make those projections and estimates. And all of these are important, but the most important one is the text. But first, let's talk about the title. So the title of the measure it's the official name of the ballot measure, and it showcases the main subject areas of the measure. And in a way, it's the summary of the summary, really. So it'll say Amendment 1 or question number 1. Should the state legislature do blah, blah, blah? And that's your title. And sometimes the titles will be a little bit lengthier. Sometimes they'll be a little bit shorter, and each state might have different laws as to how long those titles can be. But in any case, that's the shortest part of the amendment, typically speaking. Then you've also got the summary of the ballot measure. It's a brief synopsis of what the ballot measure does. So it tries to take as much of what is in the ballot measure as possible and describe what it does in plain English. And that's where a lot of these readability laws come into play. A lot of times they talk about the summary. So the full text can be that higher literacy level, and then the summaries tend to be lower requirements to understand. So they're meant to make ballot measures clearer as to what they do, in theory at least, because some text is so long that summaries cannot possibly cover every little piece of information in those texts. And each state has their own laws as to how summaries can be written, who writes them, what the approval process is in order to have that summary be put on the ballot. Because sometimes the summary that they have at one point may be ruled by the chief elections official in that state as insufficient, and so they have to go back and rewrite that summary, even if the ballot measure itself has technically been approved for the ballot. It can get very convoluted, and of course, each state has its own ways of doing that. And then the most important part of a ballot measure is, of course, the full text. It's the full transcription of what the measure does. If it gets passed into law, this is exactly what the measure is going to look like when it's put into law. So sometimes, in fact, a lot of times, it will be written in legalese. So it may look a little jargony, but in state laws, they also oftentimes, if there is jargon, they will have a separate section that says what words are defined as. Even if you think that there are words that are pretty straightforward or terms that are pretty straightforward, they won't necessarily be. You have to specifically codify what they are. Like with the rise of artificial intelligence, you have to specify what counts as artificial intelligence. Because really, artificial intelligence has been around for quite a while. It's been around in all sorts of technical applications, and it's been around in things like video games for a while. It's just this level of artificial intelligence, these capabilities, these large language learning models or large language models, the LLMs, these are relatively new. And with it becoming more and more complex and more powerful very quickly, you really have to come up with specific laws to really figure out how to handle this explosion in artificial intelligence. And so sometimes the text can be very short, like one or two sentences, and then sometimes it can be very convoluted passages. It really just depends on what the intention of the ballot measure is, what the subject matter is, where in the law it's trying to amend things. Sometimes it's really just trying to tweak one thing, and then other times it's trying to tweak a lot of things. And sometimes that also depends on that single subject rule. But in any case, the full text of the ballot measure almost never actually appears on the ballot. That's why we have summaries, because you can't fit all that text onto a ballot. You go and look up some of the ones that you're going to be voting on. Imagine if you had the entire text of that ballot measure on your ballot. And if people did not read them ahead of time, they're certainly not going to read them when it gets to the ballot box, at least in a lot of cases. But in any case, most times the text is going to be just way too long to fit onto the ballot because you've got a whole bunch of other offices to vote on. You might have other ballot measures to vote on. Like some areas will have a ton of local measures. There's like some places in Texas that will have a bajillion local ballot measures to vote on. And they got to be able to fit them as many as possible. So summaries are paramount in those cases. You can't just have all the text on there. Even if some ballot measures are short enough to do that, you'll still get the summary for it. So the summary is what gets placed on the ballot instead, and so you have to search for the text yourself. Now, when you're looking at the text, you'll notice some interesting typographical, what do they call it? Typographical emphasis that is placed on these words. And so I'm going to tell you how to parse all those, because sometimes you'll see things that are underlined or struck through or in green text or in red text. Here's how you determine what the whole point of all that is. Relevant passages that are not necessarily being changed, but are right next to passages that are being changed will be shown, and they will not have anything special done to them. In most cases, there may be some exceptions, but in most cases, any text that is underlined is being added, or it's proposed to be added, or that font may be green, because usually that indicates that something is trying to be put into something. On the other hand, if text is struck through, or if the font is red, it tends to mean that that text is projected or proposed to be deleted. Plain text that has no sort of typographical emphasis means that that specific bit of existing law is staying the same. And so you might even see like one or two words by themselves just struck through, and then a lot of the rest of that passage is being kept the same. And sometimes it's not necessarily anything important. It's just to make the words, the paragraph, grammatically make sense with the rest of the function. Maybe they'll change is to are, for example. But if plain text doesn't exist at all in that ballot measure and it is all underlined, that means an entire section of law is being added. Nothing was there in that specific section prior to this ballot measure, if this ballot measure gets passed. And if a plain text does not exist and it is all struck through, that means an entire section of a law is proposed to be deleted. So if you like all those changes being made, typically speaking, if you like what is being added, or you like deleting what is proposed to be deleted, then you probably want to vote yes on that measure. If you don't want what is being added to be added, or you don't want what is being deleted to be deleted, then you probably want to vote no on that measure, because it is changing things you don't want to change. Sometimes you may actually want what is being deleted to be deleted. Sometimes you may want what is being added to be added, but there's not necessarily anything inherently more valuable about what is being added versus what is being struck through. It really just depends on whether the thing that's being gotten rid of is something you don't like and you think it needs to be removed or changed, or something that is being added that you think needs to be added. And then if you don't like those changes, then you vote no on the measure. And then lastly, past the text, is the fiscal impact statement. Again, not always available, but this tells you what the potential economic effect on the bill is. So it may tell you that it'll cost X number of dollars, or that it may generate X amount of revenue, or that it may increase taxes by X percent. And all those kinds of things can be part of the fiscal impact of the proposed ballot measure. And not every state requires a fiscal impact statement for all measures. And states that do have some sort of requirement for fiscal impact statements, they may have different criteria for them. What exactly is in them, whether they are actually on the ballot, and maybe it's not on the ballot, but it's if you look it up online, could be a whole bunch of different criteria. But it's not always going to be concrete numbers either. Sometimes you'll just get a very generic, well, this could lead to more revenue, or this could be very pricey. Obviously not quite in those, or not necessarily in those words. Well, certainly won't say pricey, but it could say this could lead to more expenditures for the government. This could lead to more taxpayer revenue for the government. So it might not necessarily be anything all that informative. Sometimes the fiscal impact statement will just flat out say, this impact is too hard to tell at this time. And at some, it kind of begs the question, why even have a fiscal impact statement in that case? But in any case, even when they are required, they won't necessarily be all that informative. And then lastly, if you look at some state government websites, I believe Nevada does this, they may also include official arguments from the support and the opposition for a ballot measure. Or a lot of times you can find these arguments on Ballotpedia, because they will have a lot of that information and a lot of the other context of these ballot measures. So I've kind of hinted at this already, because I've talked about summaries versus text, because the full text of the ballot measure is by far the most important piece of the puzzle. It is what's going to show up in the law, after all. But the full text is seldom read by voters because they rely on summaries. Kind of like how many elected officials don't always read full bills before they vote on them. Sometimes they'll just pawn it off to their legislative staff, which is part of the role of a legislative staff. Or they just see the way their party is voting and they're going to go, oh, okay, I'll vote that way too. But it's similarly to that. You have a lot of voters that don't read ballot measures all the way. But you may be asking, the summary is supposed to be basically a synopsis of the full text, right? So why can't we rely on summaries? Why can't we just say that the summaries got everything covered? What is the big deal about doing that? Well, if the full text is too long, and it often is too long to fit on a ballot, summaries can't cover everything. The text is ultimately what's going into the law, not the summary. So the summary may make things more plain as to what the bill is trying to do, or what the ballot measure is trying to do. But the way that the text in the ballot measure is written can be possibly interpreted a different way when it goes into law, whether it's because of partisan or ideological interest trying to twist the meaning of the words, or it's really just not clear cut what it's trying to do. Because the intention behind a ballot measure isn't necessarily the same as what the ballot measure ultimately does, just like for legislation in general. It's not necessarily anything nefarious. Sometimes the ballot measure may have been made with good intentions, but it just wasn't worded very well. And it's the same thing with legislation in some cases too. So there's this sort of tug and pull that we all have to wrestle with when it comes to reading summaries versus text. Each of us only has so much time, energy, and reading capability to spend. All of us do. And so it's not always as simple as just, go read both the summary and the text. What are you doing? It takes a lot of resources to do that in some cases. Every once in a while, you might have, in your jurisdiction, you might only have one or two ballot measures to read, and maybe they are short. But a lot of times, ballot measures will be longer, and you'll have a bunch of them to vote on, especially if you have a local area that has a lot of local measures to vote on, like bonds, for example. So if you're going to use just a summary, here's some of the pros and cons of using just a summary. Summary is much easier to read, and all of us, every single one of us, likes making things easier on our brains. Some of us have a higher threshold for what we'll put our brains through before we say, okay, that's enough. I'm not trying to think anymore. We all have those limits. The summary also covers most, if not all, of the main points, and it's what will show up on the ballot to vote on. So, it's a very useful guide as to what the full text of the ballot measure is trying to do. But summaries cannot account for everything in really long ballot measures, It's not what the law is ultimately going to say. That's what the full text is. And games can be played, political games can be played with how the summary is worded, either by the people that campaign for the measure or the state government that has a vested interest in whether that ballot measure passes or is defeated. And we'll be talking about that in just a moment. Ideally, the summary for your ballot measure should be your guide for what is in the text, but don't assume it's the end-all, be-all. So, now you know the pieces of a ballot measure, and you know where to find it, but it doesn't end there, because debates about ballot measures, just like in most things in politics, isn't exactly fully reasoned. It's not just about logic a lot of times. There's a lot of political games played, because like in all things politics, all sorts of games are being played to try to steer you towards someone's goal with ballot measures. It's not always underhanded or seedy, though, and some arguments do come from people that aren't trying to manipulate or pull the wool over your eyes. They're just biased. They might have a really good intention, but they are still biased. Or sometimes it's just pitfalls in logic or understanding that can lead to a vote that isn't fully informed. And it happens to everybody. I'm no exception. But here are some of the biggest obstacles to watch out for, and other things that could trip you up when it comes to trying to read and interpret ballot measures. We're going to talk about 5 of these. There's vague versus specific wording. There's emotionally charged words, purposefully murky language, heavy partisan or ideological leanings for or against a measure, and state governments overstepping their bounds and trying to influence an outcome. So, first of all, vague versus specific wording. Ballot measures can vary greatly in length. Like we said before, it could be as short as 1 or 2 sentences, and then other times it could be paragraphs long, and it can feel like reading a short story or a novel. And that's in large part dependent on how granular and detailed that these provisions in these measures get, because some of them may be vague provisions, which usually means that the measure is going to be shorter because it doesn't explain as much, and then sometimes it may be specific, which usually means that the measure is going to be longer because you're taking the time to detail things. Vague wording can mean the law can be adaptable to emerging challenges. That's part of the ethos of the U.S. Constitution, because if you read that, it's a pretty short document, relatively speaking, and it was designed partly to be able to be adapted to times as time rolled on, but it can also be twisted to serve the purposes of partisan and ideological interests in the government. If things aren't specifically laid out to mean one thing, government can try to use it to mean what they want it to mean. So it can be the vague wording of a ballot measure can be attacked by the opposition because the true intention of the measure could be obfuscated and shrouded, where it says it's trying to do this one thing, but really it's actually about this, and it's trying to open the door for this other nefarious end. Or the opposition to the ballot measure might say that the measure isn't tough enough because it doesn't detail anything, so it's just basically has no teeth. But that doesn't necessarily mean specific wording is the way to go, because specific wording can mean the law is more clear-cut on its intentions, but it could also be too rigid in what it's trying to do. And so it can be attacked by the opposition to a ballot measure because there are a lot more points of discussion that can be taken issue with. Or maybe it missed some other details that should be part of this measure. So when you're hearing all sorts of arguments about the vagueness or the specificity of these measures, these are the things to keep in mind. What about some emotionally charged words in these ballot measures, whether it's in the summary or sometimes even in the text? Because laws can be biased, and so can ballot measures try to become law. So when you read certain words, do you have a knee-jerk reaction that sways your opinion immediately, or at least heavily influences it? Because when you see words like fair, freedom, justice, rights, and so on, hold up a moment. Because chances are when those words appear, it's really just trying to underhandedly, maybe not even underhandedly, but it's still trying to impose its own bias on you as to what the measure is trying to do. Because is the measure really about what's fair, what's free, what's just? Is it really about rights or patriotism or safety? Because it's very easy to say that kind of thing. And one particular instance is we can talk about all these attempts to gerrymander by both parties, by both the Republican and Democratic parties, and both of them trying to say that their gerrymandering is fair and that the other side's gerrymandering is not fair. And case in point, one example being in Virginia, where it just passed their ballot measure that allows the General Assembly there, the state legislature there, to redraw congressional districts between 2025 and 2030. If another state redraws its districts for reasons other than completing decennial redistricting or complying with a court order. And in that ballot measure, it says basically, will you allow the General Assembly to restore fairness? But is that really fair, though? Because Republicans are acting like their gerrymandering is fair. Democrats are acting like their gerrymandering is fair. But is either attempt at redistricting really actually about fairness, or is it about power? Is it about just benefiting their own state? What is it really about? And I try to make sure that I levy this at both parties because it is a both party issue. And in general, and this is not even just a Democrat or Republican thing, this is an all of us thing. We all like to think that whenever we do things that we would call underhanded from other people, we like to say, no, I'm justified in this, though, because blah, 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 when really it's just because it benefits us. Can be a Democrat, can be a Republican, can be an independent, can be a third party. Doesn't matter. We're all capable of doing that. In the case of gerrymandering, though, it's the two main parties because they're the ones that control these kinds of processes. One side or the other does. So really think about whether any of these ballot measures, when somebody says this is about fairness, this is about freedom and safety and justice and all that, is it really about that? Because a lot of times it's really not. It's really about what benefits a certain partisan or ideological interest, not about what's actually right. And in a similar vein, you can talk about purposefully murky language also being a hindrance to really trying to interpret ballot measures and at least what somebody would consider doing the right thing when it comes to a specific ballot measure. Because sometimes ballot measures aren't biased so much as they're just purposefully convoluted, where they're made deliberately one way. They're not actually necessarily using emotionally charged words, but they shift words around so that it's harder to really understand what they're trying to do. And obviously, just talking about the text of legislation, because some states, even though they have those legal requirements for readability of ballot measures, that doesn't always have the intended effect. Because, first of all, some of those readability laws are vague. Go back to the vague and specific dichotomy. And so it can be hard to enforce comprehensibility in some cases. And the words of the ballot measures themselves may be easy to understand, but they're ordered in such a way that you have to swing around all sorts of passages in existing law to figure out what in the world this measure is trying to do. Because it could be taking section 2 of Article 1, and then all of a sudden it goes to like section 20 of Article 3, but it somehow is still relevant to each other. Or if you're talking about a state that doesn't require a single subject rule, it might be covering a whole bunch of things. And now you're trying to keep track of, oh, whoa, okay, this is one provision here. This is another provision. This is another provision. And wait, what was that first provision again? So it can get really tricky to try to remember what's going on and how things are put together. Not necessarily in states that don't have a single subject rule. Sometimes the single subject rule doesn't make that an easier thing to deal with either. And we still have many ballot measures that are above people's literacy level. Again, this is talking about summaries versus text. The readability is often applied to the summaries of the text. The text itself doesn't necessarily need to be all that readable, and summaries won't necessarily capture everything about the full text. And then some partisan and ideological and economic interests behind these measures, they might not use emotionally charged words, but they may deliberately write measures in a way that obscures what they're actually trying to do, because they know a lot of people won't read the full text of the measure. They'll rely on the summary. And sometimes these interests will be the ones who are writing these summaries too. A lot of very underhanded wheeling and dealing instances here. And sometimes it's not necessarily about partisanship or ideology. It might just be an economic interest. But a lot of times it is a heavy partisan or ideological leaning in support or opposition to a measure. So a lot of times ballot measures can actually make strange bedfellows, so to speak. It can lead to unusual coalitions of Democrats and Republicans, either for or against a ballot measure. In most cases, it'll have groups that are normally Democrat or normally Republican work together, and you would never see them work together in other instances, except for this one particular case. But if you see a ballot measure where there's a stark partisan divide in ads and editorials and so on, where Republicans are clearly on one side and Democrats are clearly on the other, you should take a moment. You should immediately pause and think, well, wait a minute. Just like in pretty much anything that's hyper partisan, you should take a moment to think about, wait a minute, hang on, something's going on here. Is this measure really trying to do what it says it's trying to do? Or conversely, maybe the opposition is full of it too. Maybe both sides are full of it. There's a thought. Sometimes it's not clearly just, oh, this ballot measure is completely a good thing. This ballot measure is completely a bad thing. A lot of times it's not. Sometimes there is good and bad, and you have to balance the good with the bad and how much good needs to be in that ballot measure for you to actually support it. And that threshold is going to be different for a lot of people. But in any case, a heavy partisan or ideological lean doesn't necessarily mean the ballot measure is bad per se, but the chances are that it isn't, or that it's just one party that is benefiting from that ballot measure. So you should still be careful. And then lastly, state governments getting overly involved in the wording of ballot measures is another big problem that they run into. And you're seeing more and more examples recently of state governments trying to push through or kill ballot measures far more than they should. Not just simply, oh, the governor of a state is saying, I think this ballot measure sucks and people shouldn't vote for it. No, there are cases where the governments are using their own websites, which are ostensibly nonpartisan, which are purely supposed to be there just for everybody to be able to access and not dictated towards one party, at least ideally. But these websites might start telling these voters, hey, this measure is bad. You shouldn't vote against it. It's costly. It's lying to you. This is not what it's actually trying to do. Or it might conversely try to say, oh, you really need to push through this ballot measure. Or they may use these fiscal impact statements to say something is going to be economically adverse to the state when they didn't actually try to analyze it. They just said that outright because their bias says, oh, this is going to be costly for the state. They didn't actually try to run analysis on it. Or even, perhaps even worse, they've taken out ads with taxpayer dollars to attack certain measures or to prop up certain measures. It's not just enough for them to use their website or anything. They'll actually use taxpayer dollars to try to campaign for or against, which is not supposed to be legal, but it does happen. And sometimes it's not necessarily fully proven that that's what happened, but you know that the state government has done that it has used taxpayer dollars through and for means that it's not supposed to be used for partisan and ideological lobbying. And then in other cases, governments will try to kill a ballot measure before it even reaches the ballot. They might try to say that the ballot measure doesn't meet the single subject requirement for ballot measures. Try to say, oh, no, see, it actually covers two different things here. And a lot of times, not saying that that's necessarily inaccurate, but a lot of times the state government is just trying to use and abuse the single subject rule for its own purposes, not because it actually, that ballot measure is violating the single subject rule, but because the people who are running that government have a vested interest, partisan, ideological, or economic, against that ballot measure. Or same thing for the separate vote requirement, trying to take a ballot measure to court, or even if the ballot measure passes the voters and the voters approve it, they may still try to take it to court afterwards to try to put in one last ditch effort to try to kill a ballot measure. This isn't necessarily unjustified in every case. I don't want to say it like it is, but a lot of times it is based on partisan considerations rather than a truly legal basis. So that is going to do it for today's episode of the podcast. Hopefully this became a lot easier for you to read and interpret ballot measures. And like I said, I have a webinar where I talk about how to read and interpret state legislation, which is a similar concept. There are some similarities in how to read ballot measures versus state legislation. You can reach out to me about that either on LinkedIn or at paulraderwrites@gmail.com. Other links in the show notes, my LinkedIn, my Facebook, medium.com profile, website, 5-day educational email course about how we can all more effectively mitigate polarization and some of the ways that we accidentally make polarization worse, and my book on Amazon, and believe that's it. So thank you all so much for listening. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. This is on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Hopefully we'll expand to more podcasting platforms, and we'll see you next time.